The interruption came in the heat of a territorial negotiation. A thin, fractured whisper vibrated through the receiver. "Sir, please come home now. She'll destroy her." Rian Valtieri was a man who lived in a world of terror. He recognized the tremors of fear, the scent of a trap, and the cold reality of betrayal. But the sound of Soleil's voice, usually a calm fixture in this household, was shaking with a desperation that turned his veins to ice. He was at the gates of his mansion in less than 8 minutes. The instant he crossed the threshold, the silence of the house struck him with the force of a physical blow. There was no piano music, no light-hearted questions, only a hollow, muffled whimpering, not from his wife, but from his daughter. Rian prowled down the hallway, each step deliberate and deadly. Soleil trailed in his wake, her hands a blur of tremors, her mouth moving in a silent panic that robbed her of words. When he reached the parlor, he came to a dead stop. Kalis Rue, the elegant woman he had crowned as the queen of his home and heart, was standing in the center of the room, her sophisticated facade twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Elira was on the floor, curled in a bright red dress, her small hands raised to shield a face wide with terror. Rian had witnessed executions and the brutal mechanics of the underworld, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a predator wearing his wife's face, hunting the one soul he would burn the city to protect. Rian Valtieri sat in the back of his armored sedan, the city blurring past in a streak of neon and steel. To the world, he was the apex predator, a man whose name was whispered in the corridors of power and shouted in the back alleys of the criminal underworld. He had built a literal fortress around his life, a high-walled mansion guarded by the most elite security money could buy, all designed to protect the one thing that truly mattered, his 8-year-old daughter, Elira Mavine. He managed his empire with cold, surgical precision, believing that by securing the streets, he was securing his home. He was a man who understood the value of high-stakes negotiations and territorial dominance. Yet, as he checked his watch, a timepiece worth more than most people's homes, he remained blissfully unaware that the sand beneath his fortress was beginning to shift. Inside the Valtieri estate, the air was thick with a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Rian had married Kalis Rue 3 years ago, convinced she was the miracle needed to fill the hollowed-out silence left by his first wife's death. He saw Kalis as a sophisticated partner, a woman of silk and poise who seemed to adore Elira from their very first meeting. He watched Elira smile again and heard her laughter echo through the halls, allowing himself to believe that the structure Kalis provided was exactly what a motherless child required. He was blinded by his own professional success and the exhaustion of managing a criminal dynasty, failing to see the subtle change in his daughter's demeanor. He didn't notice how Elira's questions became fewer, how her laughter became more cautious, or how she began to flinch whenever Kalis entered a room. Rian's external power was absolute, but it was a shield that only faced outward. He spent his days hunting enemies on the streets, while the greatest threat to his bloodline sat at his own dinner table. He trusted Kalis completely, grateful for the discipline she maintained while he was away on business trips. He dismissed the small red flags as growing pains or boundaries being tested, effectively delegating his daughter's spirit to a woman who viewed the child as nothing more than a rival for his attention. His empire was a fortress of sand, grand and imposing on the outside, but built upon a foundation of misplaced trust and professional distraction. While he worked to burn the world to protect her, he was missing the fact that the fire had already started inside his own walls. Kalis Rue had swept into the Valtieri mansion 3 years ago like a hurricane wrapped in silk, appearing to be the very miracle Rian and Elira desperately needed. To Ryan, she was the miracle who brought life back to the empty, echoing halls of their home after the long shadow of his first wife's death. She was stunning, sophisticated, and seemed to adore Illyra from the moment they met, performing the role of the loving mother with a precision that blinded even a man as suspicious as Ryan Valtieri. He saw a second chance at happiness and leaned into the illusion, unaware that miracles often come with a price darker than any deal he had ever brokered in the criminal underworld. But as the months passed, the silk began to reveal the serpent beneath. The erosion of the home's peace was not a sudden explosion, but a systematic, quiet leaching of joy. While Ryan was away managing his empire, Kylise began establishing a new order that was perfect, silent, and suffocating. She criticized Illyra's manners, her appearance, and even her most innocent questions, treating the bright child like a porcelain doll that was meant to be seen but never heard. The vibrant, curious girl who once filled the house with laughter began to change, her spirit withering under a regime of structure that was actually a cage. Soleil Wittrin, the maid who had served the family for years, watched this transition with growing dread. She noticed how Illyra would flinch when Kylise entered a room, her small shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. Kylise's rules were absolute: no running, no loud voices, and especially no tears when Ryan left for business. When Soleil tried to intervene, suggesting that an 8-year-old child needed room to simply be a child, Kylise's response was swift and cold, reminding the maid to stay in her lane. To Kylise, Illyra was not a daughter to be loved, but the final obstacle standing between her and complete control over Ryan's heart and fortune. Ryan, exhausted from the weight of his dynasty, wanted to believe the lies Kylise fed him. She painted a picture of a difficult child who needed discipline, and Ryan, still grieving, chose to trust his wife's clinical explanations. He didn't see the bruised wrists hidden beneath long sleeves, or hear the conversations where Kylise called the girl worthless. He saw only a perfect home, while beneath the surface, the serpent in silk was slowly poisoning the very soul of the girl he had sworn to protect. Soleil Wittrin moved through the Valtieri mansion like a shadow, her footsteps silent on the polished marble that reflected a home becoming increasingly cold. She had served this family for years, but the woman she served now was not the mother she had hoped for. The erosion of peace became undeniable on a Thursday morning when Soleil entered Illyra's room to gather laundry. The young girl was sitting on the edge of her bed, her small frame hunched as she tried to pull a long-sleeved sweater over her head. As the fabric snagged, Illyra let out a sharp, indrawn breath of pain. Soleil knelt beside her, gently guiding the girl's arm. When the sleeve fell back, Soleil's heart plummeted. Encircling Illyra's delicate wrists were fingerprint-shaped bruises, a deep, angry purple against her pale skin. "What is this, princess?" Soleil whispered, her voice thick with a mix of grief and rising fury. Illyra wouldn't meet her eyes, her gaze fixed on the floor as she whispered that she had been clumsy, echoing the very words Kylise used to break her. But Soleil knew the truth. She had heard the sharp, stinging slaps through the heavy oak doors, and the systematic way Kylise called the child worthless when Rion was away. That afternoon, Soleil retreated to her small quarters and pulled out a plain, black-bound notebook, her Book of Truth. With hands that shook but never faltered, she began to document the hidden evidence of the Valtieri home. She noted the date, the time, and the exact description of the bruises on Illyra's wrists. She recorded the conversations she overheard where Kylise called the girl a burden on her father's success. She even took a grainy photo with her phone, capturing the way Illyra flinched at the sound of a closing door. Soleil knew the danger of what she was doing. In Rion Valtieri's world, a maid was meant to clean and cook, not parent or investigate. Kylise had already warned her to stay in her lane with a coldness that felt like a death threat.
Yet every time Soleil looked at the watchman's alarm, the phone she kept tucked in her apron, she knew she was the only one standing between Elira and the monster wearing her mother's face. She was the silent witness in the hallway, building a ledger of cruelty that would one day be Rion's only map back to his daughter's soul. The vibrant music that once defined the Valtieri mansion began to fade, replaced by an eerie, oppressive stillness that felt like a physical weight. For years, Elira's piano lessons and her habit of singing while she did her homework had been the heartbeat of the home. But under Kaelis's cold regime, the girl had learned that joy carried a heavy price. The transformation was systematic. Kaelis had convinced the child that her natural exuberance was a burden to her father, a selfish demand for attention that he simply did not have the time to give. Elira, who used to dance in the hallways when she thought no one was looking, was now being trained to be a porcelain doll, perfect, silent, and motionless. The spirit of fear took hold with terrifying efficiency, manifesting in the way Elira began to shrink into herself, trying to become as small and invisible as possible to avoid Kaelis's biting critiques. She stopped asking her 100 curious questions, her dark eyes losing the spark they once shared with her late mother. Instead of a bright, curious child, Rion was now coming home to a nervous wreck who kept her eyes downcast, afraid to make eye contact even with the man who would burn the world to protect her. This withdrawal was not the natural maturation Kaelis claimed it was. It was a psychological retreat into a fortress of silence, where Elira felt she could finally be safe from the monster wearing her mother's face. Soleil watched from the shadows as Elira's song died out completely. She saw the girl sit for hours in the nursery, clutching a torn notebook of drawings she was now too afraid to show her father, convinced they were nothing more than childish scribbles. The mansion, once a place of refuge, had become a site of systematic, calculated cruelty, where love had to be earned and respect was maintained through terror. While Rion remained blinded by the illusion of a disciplined home, Soleil noted the final, heartbreaking change. Elira no longer cried out when she was hurt. She had learned that no one was coming to save her, and her silent cry became the most damning indictment of the Valtieri fortress.
Ryan Valtieri had survived 2 decades in the criminal underworld because he possessed an instinct for the hunt that others lacked, a sensory perception that alerted him to a threat long before it struck. But as the winter chill settled over the city, that instinct, his gift of discernment, began to scream within the very walls he called his sanctuary. It wasn't a loud alarm. It was a subtle, creeping sensation that made his blood run cold every time he stepped through the front doors. He realized with a jarring clarity that the daughter who used to run to him with 100 questions had become a ghost in her own home. Elira didn't dance in the hallways anymore, and when she looked at Kaelis, Ryan saw fear in her eyes instead of love. The professional distraction that had shielded Kaelis for 3 years finally began to dissolve. Ryan started to notice the fingerprint bruises on Elira's wrists, marks Kaelis dismissively explained away as the result of a difficult phase or a need for restraint. He saw his daughter's small hands trembling and the way she held herself like someone expecting pain. The calculation that ruled his business life merged with a burgeoning protective fury. He realized he had been trusting people blindly, and in his world, that was a mistake that cost lives. Instead of a direct confrontation that might put Elira in immediate danger, Ryan pivoted. He began a secret investigation that would have terrified his enemies on the street. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a predator protecting his family. He ordered a total audit of the household, from bank records and phone logs to the high-definition security footage that Kaelis believed she controlled. He wanted the names of every background figure who had watched his daughter wither and chose to stay silent.
Deep within the mansion's digital architecture, Ryan activated a system of hidden microphones and cameras that even Kalis didn't know existed. He began to compile the hidden scrolls of her betrayal, the hours and hours of footage that would document the systematic, psychological torture of his child. As he watched the data populate his private server in the dead of night, the protective note in his heart turned into a death sentence. He realized that the miracle he had brought into his home was a predator who had targeted a grieving family. The investigation was no longer about proof. It was about preparing a reckoning from which there would be no escape.
The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in November, a day when the autumn light filtered through the mansion windows with a deceptive, golden warmth. Ryan was across town, his attention anchored to a territorial dispute that threatened to ignite the streets into open warfare. Meanwhile, in the suffocating silence of the parlor, Elira sat at the antique mahogany coffee table, a piece of furniture Callies prized above almost all else, working on a school project about family trees. With colored pencils in hand, she was carefully drawing a picture of her late mother, trying to reclaim a memory that Callies had spent years attempting to erase. The tragedy was born from a moment of pure, clumsy innocence. As Elira reached for a red crayon to color her mother's dress, her small hand knocked over a glass of water. The liquid spread across the expensive wood like a slow-moving stain, seeping into the grain. Panic, sharp and cold, seized the child. She grabbed paper towels, her hands trembling as she tried to scrub away the evidence of her mistake, whispering apologies to a room that offered no mercy. When Callies entered, she didn't see an 8-year-old child in distress. She saw an affront to her meticulously curated world of perfection. Her manicured hands clenched into fists, and her face, usually a mask of sophisticated poise, twisted with a rage that had been building for months. "You stupid, clumsy little brat," Callies exploded, her voice cutting through the mansion like a serrated blade. To Callies, the water on the mahogany was more than a mess. It was a symbol of Elira's continued existence, an imperfect, needy reminder of the woman Ryan had truly loved. From the doorway, Soleil watched, frozen by the venom in the woman's tone. Callies loomed over the girl, mocking her offer to use her allowance to fix the damage. "You're just like your mother," Callies sneered, leaning down to strike at the child's most vulnerable point. "Weak, worthless, a constant disappointment to everyone around you." When Elira whimpered a defense of her mother, Callies's cruelty reached its zenith. She informed the child that her mother was dead because even God couldn't stand someone so pathetic. This was the altar of pride, where Callies sacrificed a child's spirit to satisfy her own need for dominance. Soleil retreated into the hallway, her hands shaking as she pulled out the watchman's alarm. She dialed Ryan's number again and again, ignoring the silent mode he kept for his meetings. Underneath the sound of Callies' screaming, Soleil could hear the broken sobs of a girl who finally believed she was worthless. On the 4th try, the line clicked open. Soleil didn't offer a greeting. She offered a warning that would change the Valtieri bloodline forever. "Sir, please come home now. She'll destroy her." The drive home felt like an eternity, Rion's knuckles white on the steering wheel as the meeting he had abandoned mid-sentence became a distant, inconsequential shadow. He burst through the front doors of the mansion, met not by the music of Elira's piano, but by an oppressive, eerie silence that made his skin crawl. Soleil appeared at his side, her face pale and streaked with tears, pointing toward the main parlor with a hand that would not stop shaking. Rion moved through his own home with the lethal grace of a predator stalking prey, his heart breaking and his blood boiling as he heard the sharp, cold edge of Kalis' voice mingled with his daughter's quiet whimpers. He reached the parlor doorway and froze. The scene was a nightmare. Kalis stood in the center of the room, her elegant facade disheveled, methodically tearing pages from Elira's school notebook and scattering them across the rug like confetti.
Elira was pressed against the far wall, her small body trembling in her stained school uniform, her dark eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. Rian watched in horror as Kalis mocked the girl's drawings, telling her that her father had no time for childish scribbles and that she was nothing more than a burden who reminded him of things he was trying to forget. When Kalis raised her hand and Elira flinched, preparing for a blow that had clearly become a routine, something inside Rian Valtieri finally snapped. He had built an empire to protect his family, yet he had allowed a monster to torture his child under his own roof. He stepped into the room with the silence of death itself. Kalis spun around, her face instantly shifting from predator to victim, beginning a practiced lie about Elira's behavior and the antique table. But Rian wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the fingerprint bruises on Elira's wrists and the way she kept her gaze lowered, the unmistakable signs of a child living in constant fear. "Papa!" Elira's voice was a fragile thread of hope and terror. Rian knelt down, making himself small as his daughter ran to him, sobbing into his shoulder with a desperate relief that spoke of months of hidden agony. As he held her shaking body, the cold calculation of his business life merged with a protective fury. He looked up at Kalis, and for the first time she saw her own end in his eyes. He was no longer just the boss of a crime family, he was a father protector, and the reckoning had finally arrived at the door. "Rosa," he said with absolute authority, "take Elira to the kitchen. Papa needs to have a conversation with Kalis." The door clicked shut behind Elira and Soleil, leaving a silence in the parlor that felt heavier than a funeral shroud. Kalis straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting in a practiced gesture of defiance as she prepared to manipulate her way out of the wreckage of her own making. She began to speak of discipline and the complexities of raising a child who was not her own, but Rian simply walked to his desk, his movements carrying the cold, final resonance of a judge approaching the bench. He spread a thick manila folder across the mahogany surface, the paper white and stark against the dark wood. "Did you think I survived 20 years by ignoring threats just because they wore pretty faces?" Rian's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Kalis's confidence flickered as he laid out bank records and phone logs, but the true judgment was yet to come. Rian reached out and pressed a button on his desk, activating the hidden scrolls, the digital ledger of the last 6 months. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of Kalis's own voice, stripped of its sophisticated veneer and dripping with a venom that made the room feel small. "Stop sniveling, you pathetic little brat," the recording hissed through the hidden speakers. Kalis gasped, her hands beginning to shake as she heard herself call Elira worthless, telling the child that her father had no time for her tears and that her late mother had been a disappointment. Rian watched her with eyes like steel as act after act of psychological torture played back in high-fidelity clarity. He forced her to listen to the sound of things being thrown, the sound of Elira's muffled whimpers, and the sound of a child begging for a mercy that Kalis had never intended to give. Kalis's facade shattered completely as she realized every private moment of cruelty had been documented by the very man she sought to control. She tried to claim the pressure of her position, but Rian's face only grew darker. He had hours of proof that she was not a struggling stepmother, but a predator who had targeted his grieving family to serve her own vanity. The recordings were the judgment of secret things, exposing the monster that had been living in his home while he was busy building an empire to protect it. As the final recording faded into a haunting silence, Rian looked at the woman he had once called a miracle and saw only a stranger. The trial was over, and the time for the sentence had arrived. The reality of her ruined position hit Kalis with the force of a landslide as the recordings fell silent. Ryan stood before her, no longer the blinded husband, but a judge delivering a cold and final sentence. He watched the blood drain from her face, her sophisticated arrogance replaced by a frantic, trembling desperation. She began to plead, promising change and offering hollow apologies, but Ryan merely looked at her with eyes that had seen through 1,000 lies. He realized now that he had been playing gangster in the streets, while a real monster was uprooting his life from within. "Get out of my house," Ryan whispered, the words carrying the absolute authority of a man who had survived 20 years of betrayal. When Kaylis attempted to lift her chin and speak of her legal rights as his wife, Ryan stopped her with a single sharp gesture. He reminded her to check the prenuptial agreement she had signed 3 years ago, specifically the clause his lawyers had inserted to protect his bloodline. The agreement was now null and void because she had dared to harm his daughter. She was leaving with nothing, stripped of the status, power, and luxury she had fought so hard to steal. Ryan informed her that she had exactly 1 hour to pack her personal belongings. Soleil would supervise her every move to ensure she didn't take a single item that didn't belong to her, effectively purging the mansion of her presence. Kaylis collapsed into a chair, the game she thought she was winning finally over. She had viewed love as a transactional game, but Ryan had remembered that true love, unconditional and fierce, was the only foundation that could hold a fortress together. As the staff began the process of her removal, the atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. The thorns that had choked the life out of his home for 3 years were finally being uprooted. Ryan watched the monster wearing his wife's face shrink into a hollow stranger, realizing that her power had only existed because of his own blindness. He had built walls to keep enemies out, but today he had finally cleared the poison from the garden. The banishment was more than a legal maneuver, it was a spiritual cleansing of the Valtieri estate.
6 months after the thorns had been uprooted, the Valtieri mansion was no longer an eerie fortress of silence, but a sanctuary filled with the resonance of a life reclaimed. The heavy, oppressive emptiness that once made Ryan's skin crawl had been replaced by the sound of Alira's piano lessons and the spontaneous music of her laughter echoing through the halls. She had returned to her old self, curious, joyful, and moving through the rooms with a lightness that proved the spirit of fear had finally lost its grip. The porcelain doll was gone, replaced by a bright, vibrant child who no longer flinched at the sound of a closing door or the approach of a shadow. Ryan had restructured his entire world to protect this newfound peace, stepping away from the cold calculations of his business empire to become a constant present force in his daughter's life. He realized that while he had built walls to keep the world out, the true work of a father was building a home where love did not have to be earned and respect was not maintained through terror. He often sat in the parlor, watching Alira draw in a new notebook, her childish scribbles now treated as the masterpieces of a soul that was safe to express itself once more. The kitchen had become the heart of their home, a place of warmth where Soleil served hot chocolate and witnessed the genuine, bright smiles that had been missing for 3 long years. Ryan often looked at Soleil with a profound, quiet gratitude, knowing that her brave phone call had been the alarm that saved both him and his daughter from a darkness they hadn't known how to name. The watchman's alarm had evolved into a legacy of grace, a reminder that the truth will always surface when family matters more than anything else. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden light through the widened windows of the mansion, Ryan watched Alira dance in the hallway just as she used to do when she thought no one was looking. The house of grace was complete. He had lost a wife, but he had found his daughter. And in her unconditional love, the Mafia boss who thought he was the predator finally found his own redemption. The song had returned, and this time it was a melody that would never be silenced again.